Finished reading The Wrack by John Bierce. So I read this is a fantasy novella by the same author as The City That Would Eat the World, which I read earlier this year. That was a slightly longer fantasy novel. I have a review of that one on my channel. But The Wrack is a fantasy novella about a plague. And unfortunately, it came out in 2020, which probably hurt the book a little bit in terms of marketing. But it was written before the events of 2020 slash late 2019 slash 2021. So it was not an intentional parallel to real life, but that is when it came out. But anyways, it's in like a fantasy setting on this continent that has a couple of different countries, and the book kind of follows the spread of the plague through these countries. And we kind of bounce around between different characters. We don't spend too long with any one character. There are some that we come back to multiple times, and then there's some characters that we only get one chapter on, and then we never see them again. But I think there's two or three different plot lines that we come back to several times throughout the book. And it takes place over the course of several months, I think. Maybe even close to a year, but at least several months. And we follow the spread of this disease. We follow some political developments, like neighboring rival kingdoms trying to take advantage of the weakened state of their neighbors and invading, and then they get the plague when they invade. So that's kind of interesting. And then towards the end of the book, like the last third of the book, we follow uh, a couple of healers sort of figuring out the cause of the plague and how to stop it. And then the name that they give to this plague is the Wrack, hence the title of the book. And it's the symptoms are so at first you're like delirious and you start screaming and like writhing in pain. And then after that, either you die, oftentimes of heart failure, or if you survive it, you end up surviving with um, like your fingers and toes turn black, almost like you had frostbite, and you lose a lot of dexterity in your fingers and in your limbs in general. So it's a very scary thing, and um, it seems to infect wealthy people first in a city, and then it trickles down to the rest of the population. And that ends up being one of the clues to figure out how it's spreading and like what the mechanisms of it are. So yeah, it's really interesting. It's again, we don't spend a ton of time with any one character, not a ton of like characterization, so it's almost it reads almost like a historical account of these couple months that the plague spread through this continent. Um, but we do get like pretty nice portraits of the personalities of these characters during this short amount of time we do get with them. Um, so I think it's an interesting format that the author constrained himself to, and he does a lot, about as much as you could expect him to do in terms of characterization within that format, where, we're only getting a couple pages with each character sometimes. Um, so yeah, I think that was really good. I liked the way that it portrayed epidemiology, which is not something I'm knowledgeable about at all, just to clarify, but it felt very realistic and scientific, I would say, based on my opinion as a layperson. Not a medical professional at all, but yeah, he did a good job with that, and I think the fantasy elements to it were interesting. I really liked the world building in terms of the fantasy elements of it. There's not a ton, I will say. There's not like wizards and magical creatures and stuff like that. They have a magical system of communication, and the way that that's integrated into the plague storyline is definitely interesting. And then there's like some supernatural, uh, almost like ghost or demon things in this one corner of the setting, which is touched on quite a bit at the start of the book, and then we don't there's not actually a ton of that that ends up being relevant towards the end. So yeah, I don't know. I did feel to some extent like this this story didn't have to be told in a fantasy setting. And in that sense, maybe like I like a fantasy story that takes full advantage of the fact that it's a fantasy story, you know? Um, like just to compare fantasy to sci-fi, like there's always a point to the sci-fi technology. It always does something that is essential to the plot or to the themes or to both. Whereas fantasy, sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't matter that it's in a fantasy setting. And this maybe was a case where it doesn't really matter. Um, like, I mean, you could have very easily written this exact same story in a contemporary setting and it wouldn't really have changed anything. Um, Although, yeah, I mean, I will say the way that the magical communication system is incorporated is interesting. Um, and then also they have this thing where people can remove one of their eyes and replace it with a gemstone in order to see this like parallel dimension of like magical energy, and they can use that to help them see like medical problems. And it's also related to the communication system that they have. So some interesting ideas there. Um, yeah, I mean, none of the fantasy elements are like essential to the plot or to the themes, as far as I could tell. But they're not detrimental to it either. And I do love fantasy as a genre. Uh, so I'm not complaining per se. But yeah, I really liked this. I know the author. He has a series that he just started earlier this year that I read the first book of, The City That Would Eat the World. I want to continue that whenever he puts out another one of those. His other series, I think, is more of like a progression fantasy, which I went through a phase with that like a year and a half ago, but I think I'm not into it now. So I don't know if I'll check that out. But I really liked this. So this was the Wrack by John Bierce, and yeah, I don't have a physical copy to hold up because I read it as an ebook on mostly on my laptop, a little bit on my phone. But yeah, I liked it. Uh, I think that's all I had to say. And yeah, no, that is all.